The fluorescent lights of the executive floor buzzed like angry wasps at 6:47 a.m., and Valencia Brown moved through the silence like a ghost nobody wanted to see. Her hands, weathered and strong, gripped the handle of her cleaning cart as she pushed it across the polished marble floors of Meridian Financial Group's headquarters in downtown Atlanta. The building didn't wake up for another 2 hours, but Valencia had been awake since 4, riding 2 buses from the southwest side just to make sure these floors sparkled before the people in expensive shoes arrived to walk all over them. She didn't mind the work. Honest work never broke anybody, her grandmother used to say. What bothered Valencia was the way people looked through her like she was made of air. Not at her, through her, like she was part of the furniture, something that came with the building, programmed to appear and disappear on command. Valencia was 53 years old, though her hands looked 70 and her eyes looked ancient. She'd raised 3 children alone after her husband died in a construction accident when she was 31. No life insurance, no settlement, just a casket and a stack of bills that still hadn't stopped coming. Her oldest, Jerome, was a paramedic now. Her middle child, Shanice, taught 5th grade in Decatur. Her baby, Khalil, was finishing his degree in computer science at Georgia State. She'd cleaned 1,000 floors to put them through school, and she'd do it 1,000 times more without complaint. But this morning, something was different. This morning, Valencia felt a weight pressing down on her chest that had nothing to do with the mop bucket or the arthritis flaring up in her knees. Maybe it was the way Tiffany from HR had looked at her yesterday, that slight curl of the lip when Valencia asked if there was a problem with her insurance paperwork. Maybe it was the way Brandon from accounting had literally stepped over her while she was scrubbing a coffee stain, talking on his phone about his weekend in Miami, like she wasn't even human enough to acknowledge. Valencia pushed her cart into the executive conference room on the 42nd floor, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a throne room overlooking a kingdom. This was where the real decisions got made, where men and women in suits that cost more than her monthly rent decided who got loans, who got denied, who got to build their dreams, and who got to keep struggling. She started with the windows, spraying and wiping in smooth circular motions, watching the sunrise paint the Atlanta skyline in shades of gold and amber. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself imagine what it must feel like to sit in one of these chairs, to have people listen when you spoke, to never worry about which bill to pay first, to be seen. The sound of voices in the hallway snapped her back to reality. Absolutely ridiculous that we even have to deal with this. Valencia's hand froze mid-wipe. The voices were getting closer, and she recognized them immediately. Tiffany Clark from HR, Brandon Wessex from accounting, and Jasmine Mitchell from marketing. The young guns, the rising stars, the ones who walked these halls like they owned them because, in a way, they did. They were being groomed for bigger things. Everyone knew it. They had the pedigree, the connections, the look. Valencia glanced at the door. She should make herself known, clear her throat, say good morning, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the tone in Tiffany's voice, sharp and dismissive. Maybe it was the laughter that followed. Maybe it was just that Valencia had been invisible for so long that being silent came naturally. She stepped behind the portable partition in the corner, the one they used for video conferences, and continued wiping down the side table, not hiding, exactly, just staying out of the way, like always. "I'm just saying," Tiffany continued, as they entered the room. "The optics are terrible. Did you see her trying to fill out those forms?" I had to explain what beneficiary meant 3 times. Valencia's chest tightened. They were talking about her. "I don't understand why we can't just hire a professional service," Brandon said, and Valencia could hear him settling into one of the leather chairs. "You know, one of those companies where people show up, do their job, and leave. No paperwork, no benefits, no complications." Because Mrs. Chen is obsessed with this family environment nonsense, Jasmine replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She thinks keeping legacy employees makes us look good. Meanwhile, we have cleaning ladies who can barely read wandering around our executive floors. Do you know how that looks to clients? The words hit Valencia like a slap. Barely read. She'd read every night to her children when they were young. Even after working 12-hour days, she'd read their homework assignments, their college essays, their scholarship applications. She'd read every medical bill, every eviction notice, every letter from the bank threatening to take the house. She could read just fine. She just hadn't had anyone to read to her when she was growing up. Nobody to help with the big words. Nobody to tell her that her mind was worth investing in. Honestly, I don't know how she even got hired, Tiffany continued. Background check must have been a joke. I saw her W-2 last month when processing year-end paperwork. Guess what she makes? I don't want to know, Brandon said, laughing. $28,000 a year. Can you imagine? In this city, she probably lives in some roach-infested apartment in the hood. With like 6 kids and no baby daddy, Jasmine added. And all 3 of them laughed. Valencia's hand trembled against the window. 3 kids, 1 baby daddy, a husband who'd worked himself to death trying to provide, a woman who'd sacrificed everything so her children wouldn't have to clean floors like she did. You know what the worst part is? Tiffany said, and Valencia could hear her moving closer to the window, probably admiring the same view Valencia had been mesmerized by moments before. People like her are the reason our insurance premiums are so high. She's constantly filing claims for her prescriptions, her back problems, her whatever. I had to process her request for physical therapy last week. Physical therapy for a cleaning lady. Maybe if she lost some weight and took care of herself, she wouldn't need all these accommodations. Something inside Valencia cracked. Not broke. She'd been broken before and put herself back together too many times to shatter now. This was different. This was the moment the invisible woman realized she was tired of being invisible, tired of being grateful for scraps, tired of shrinking herself so other people could feel bigger. But she didn't move, not yet. She needed to hear all of it. Needed to know exactly who these people were when they thought nobody was watching. I heard she's trying to get her son a job here, Brandon said. Can you imagine? Probably wants us to hire him for IT or something, just because his mama mops our floors. That's not how the world works. That's exactly how they think the world should work. Though, Jasmine replied. Handouts, affirmative action, diversity hires. Meanwhile, people like us who actually worked for our degrees and earned our spots have to compete with people who think proximity to success means they deserve it. Valencia's jaw clenched. Khalil had a 3.8 GPA. He'd been coding since he was 14, teaching himself on a laptop she'd bought from a pawn shop. He'd never asked for a handout in his life, but she'd mentioned to Tiffany that her son was graduating soon. Asked if there were any entry-level positions he could apply for. Not special treatment, just a chance, just an application. Well, it won't happen on my watch, Tiffany said firmly. I'm not putting my reputation on the line for nepotism, especially not for… She paused, and Valencia could hear the smile in her voice. Let's just say I'm committed to maintaining our company's standards. Amen to that, Brandon agreed. This place is a meritocracy. Always has been, always should be. Speaking of which, Jasmine said, did you guys hear about the new CEO? Valencia's ears perked up. There had been whispers for weeks. The founder, Richard Chen, was stepping down. His widow, Mrs. Chen, who served on the board, had been instrumental in finding a replacement. But nobody knew who it was yet. The announcement was supposed to come this morning. I heard it's some hotshot from New York, Brandon said. Ivy League, connections for days, exactly what this company needs to go public. As long as they clean house, Tiffany muttered. Get rid of the dead weight, modernize. We can't be a Fortune 500 company with Section 8 employees. They laughed again, and the sound of it made Valencia's blood boil, but she stayed quiet. stayed still, stayed invisible. Because Valencia Brown knew something these three rising stars didn't know, something nobody in this building knew except for Mrs. Chen and the board of directors, something that was about to change everything. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand how Valencia ended up here, cleaning floors in a building where people spoke about her like she was garbage. You need to understand what brought her to this moment, standing behind a partition at 7:03 a.m., listening to three people destroy her dignity without even knowing she could hear them. You need to understand the weight she'd been carrying for 22 years, and why this morning, this exact morning, would be the morning everything changed. So let me take you back to when Valencia Brown wasn't a cleaning lady at all. 22 years earlier, Valencia wasn't pushing a mop, she was pushing boundaries. Her name was Valencia Brown Montgomery back then, and she worked on the 38th floor of the same building, just 4 floors below where she now cleaned windows. She was a junior financial analyst, fresh out of Spelman College, with a degree in economics and a fire in her belly that could light up the whole city. She wore Ann Taylor suits she couldn't quite afford, and heels that made her calves burn by lunchtime. But she walked those halls like she belonged there, because she did. Richard Chen had hired her himself, saw something in her during the interview that reminded him of his own hunger when he'd started the company 20 years prior. She wasn't just smart. Lots of people were smart. Valencia had vision. She could see patterns in markets that other analysts missed. She could predict shifts before they happened. She had a gift, and Richard Chen believed in nurturing gifts. "You're going to run this place someday," he'd told her once, standing at the window of his office, looking out at the same skyline Valencia would one day clean. "You've got what it takes, the mind, the drive, the heart. Don't let anyone tell you different." She'd met her husband, Terrence, that same year. He worked construction, building the new developments popping up all over Atlanta as the city exploded into the millennium. He was 6'3", with hands that could shape concrete and a smile that could melt steel. He made her laugh when the stress of work got too heavy. He made her feel safe when the doubts crept in. He made her believe that she could have it all: the career, the family, the dream. They got married at her grandmother's church in Southwest Atlanta, a small ceremony with big love. Jerome was born a year later. Shanice came 18 months after that. Valencia was managing it all: motherhood, marriage, and a career that was taking off faster than she'd ever imagined. She was being mentored by Richard Chen himself, groomed for senior analyst, then portfolio manager, then maybe one day partner. But life has a way of reminding you that control is an illusion. Terrence died on a Tuesday. A crane malfunction at a construction site in Buckhead. One moment he was there, calling her during his lunch break to ask what she wanted for dinner. The next moment, gone. The lawsuit went nowhere. The construction company had good lawyers and better insurance. Valencia got $15,000 and 3 children who didn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. The bills started immediately: funeral costs, medical bills from the hospital where they'd tried to save him, the mortgage they'd stretched themselves thin to afford, daycare for 2 babies, and after-school care for Jerome. Her salary was good, but it wasn't good enough to cover everything. Not without Terrence's income. She tried to hold on. God knows she tried. But when Jerome got sick with pneumonia and needed to be hospitalized, when the medical bills stacked up faster than her paychecks could cover them, when the daycare called her in the middle of a presentation with a client because Shanice had a fever and nobody else could pick her up, something had to give. Richard Chen tried to help, gave her time off, advanced her money, told her to take all the time she needed. But Valencia saw the looks from the other analysts, heard the whispers about special treatment, felt the resentment from colleagues who saw her absences as weakness, as proof that women, especially Black women with children, couldn't handle the pressure of finance. When Jerome ended up in the hospital again 6 months later, this time with asthma complications, Valencia made a decision that broke her heart but saved her family. She resigned. "You don't have to do this," Richard Chen had said, sitting across from her in his office. The same office where he'd once told her she'd run the company someday. "We can work something out, flexible hours, work from home. I can't keep asking for exceptions," Valencia had said quietly, holding back tears that threatened to crack her composure. "My kids need me more than I need this career right now. Maybe later, when they're older. The door will always be open," Richard had promised. "Always. When you're ready, you come back. We'll find a place for you." She'd believed him. For a while. But life doesn't wait for perfect timing. By the time Jerome and Shanice were in school, by the time baby Khalil was old enough for pre-K, Valencia had been out of the finance world for 6 years. Her resume had a gap the size of the Grand Canyon. Her skills were outdated. Her contacts had moved on. And the job market had no patience for single mothers who'd chosen their children over their careers. She applied everywhere, started high, analyst positions, junior roles, anything in finance. When those didn't pan out, she went lower. Administrative assistant, receptionist, customer service. The rejection letters piled up like unpaid bills. The house went into foreclosure. She couldn't afford it anymore, not without Terrence, not without her analyst salary. They moved into a small apartment in the same neighborhood where she'd grown up. The same neighborhood she'd worked so hard to escape. Jerome started acting out at school. Shanice became quiet. Too quiet. Khalil was too young to understand, but old enough to feel the stress that permeated their tiny 2-bedroom apartment like humidity before a storm. Valencia needed work, any work. She needed to feed her children. That's when she saw the posting. Meridian Financial Group, the same building where she used to analyze portfolios and dream about partnerships. But this time, the position wasn't on the 38th floor. It was for the overnight cleaning crew. She'd stared at that posting for 3 days before applying. The humiliation of it sat in her throat like bile. But pride doesn't feed babies. Pride doesn't keep the lights on. She got the job within a week. The hiring manager didn't recognize her. Why would he? She'd worked on a different floor, in a different world. She was just another applicant, just another black woman looking for work she was overqualified for, but desperate enough to accept. Richard Chen never knew. He'd retired a few years after she resigned, handed the reins to his CFO, and stepped back to spend time with his wife and grandchildren. By the time Valencia started pushing a mop through the building, where she'd once pushed financial boundaries, Richard was sailing in the Mediterranean, completely unaware that one of his most promising analysts was now cleaning the toilets on the executive floor. Mrs. Chen knew, though, Richard's widow. She'd been on the board since the beginning, quiet but observant. She'd watched Valencia during her analyst days, saw the potential that Richard had seen. And when she ran into Valencia one early morning, emptying trash bins on the 42nd floor, their eyes met with a recognition that made Valencia want to disappear into the walls. "Valencia," Mrs. Chen had said softly, her voice a mixture of surprise and something that looked like pain. "Yes, ma'am," Valencia had replied, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't know you were. How long have you been?" 4 years next month, Valencia had said quietly. Mrs. Chen had stood there for a long moment, her designer handbag clutched in her manicured hands, looking at this woman who used to sit in meetings with the brightest minds in finance, now wearing a janitor's uniform with bleach stains on the sleeves. "Does anyone know?" Mrs. Chen finally asked. "No, ma'am, and I'd appreciate if we kept it that way." Mrs. Chen had nodded slowly. Then she'd done something unexpected. She'd reached out and squeezed Valencia's hand. "Richard always said you were special," Mrs. Chen had said. He was right. Then she'd walked away, leaving Valencia standing in the hallway with tears streaming down her face and a mop in her hand. That was 3 years ago, and in those 3 years, Valencia had perfected the art of being invisible. She arrived before dawn and left after dark. She kept her head down, did her work, and made sure her children never knew the full extent of how far she'd fallen. To them, Mama had a job at a nice office building. They didn't need to know she was cleaning it instead of running it. But Mrs. Chen remembered. Mrs. Chen saw her, and Mrs. Chen had been planning something for a very long time. Which brings us back to that conference room. To Tiffany, Brandon, and Jasmine, laughing about the cleaning lady who couldn't read, who lived in the hood, who was dead weight dragging the company down. Valencia stayed behind that partition for another 10 minutes, listening to them discuss their weekend plans, their bonus projections, their complete lack of awareness that they'd just insulted a woman who'd forgotten more about finance than they'd ever learned. When they finally left, still laughing, still clueless, Valencia emerged from her hiding spot. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding, but her eyes were dry. She finished cleaning the conference room in silence, each swipe of the cloth sharper, each motion more deliberate. She was preparing this room for a meeting. The meeting. The one where the new CEO would be announced. And as she pushed her cart back toward the service elevator, as the sunrise fully broke over Atlanta and painted the city in morning light, Valencia allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous thing she'd allowed herself in years. She smiled, because what Tiffany, Brandon, and Jasmine didn't know, what nobody in this building except Mrs. Chen knew, was that at 9 o'clock this morning, everything was about to change. But what happened next shocked the entire neighborhood. The executive conference room on the 42nd floor was packed by 8:45. Every senior manager, every department head, every rising star who thought they had a shot at the corner office had squeezed into the space, filling the leather chairs and lining the walls. The energy was electric, buzzing with speculation and ambition. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the announcement of who would lead Meridian Financial Group into its next chapter. Tiffany sat near the front, her blazer freshly pressed, her confidence radiating like heat. Brandon was 2 seats down, checking his phone every 30 seconds, like he was already running the company. Jasmine had positioned herself near the door, strategically placed to make an impression when the new CEO arrived. The room smelled like expensive cologne and fresh coffee from the catering spread Mrs. Chen had ordered for the occasion. Croissants, fresh fruit, artisanal pastries that cost more than Valencia's weekly grocery budget. People helped themselves freely, chatting and laughing and speculating about whether the new CEO would be the Wall Street titan from Goldman Sachs or the tech wunderkind from Silicon Valley who'd been rumored for weeks. Nobody noticed when Valencia slipped in through the side door at 8:53. She was just the cleaning lady, after all, there to remove the breakfast trash before the important people began their important meeting. She moved quietly along the perimeter of the room, emptying bins, wiping down the credenza, making herself small. "Excuse me," Jasmine said sharply, barely glancing at Valencia as she stepped aside. "You need to be done before the meeting starts." "Yes, ma'am," Valencia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And take that cart with you," Brandon added, waving his hand dismissively. "This is a professional environment." Valencia nodded, her eyes downcast. She began pushing her cart toward the door, moving slowly, deliberately, taking her time. At exactly 9 o'clock, Mrs. Chen entered the room. The conversation died immediately. Mrs. Chen was 74 years old, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and the kind of presence that made grown men straighten their postures. She'd been Richard's partner in every sense of the word, in business, in marriage, in vision. When Richard had started Meridian from nothing, Mrs. Chen had been there, managing the books from their kitchen table while working full-time as a nurse. She'd sacrificed her own career to build his dream. And when the dream became a reality, Richard had made sure everyone knew. His success was her success. After Richard died 2 years ago, Mrs. Chen had remained on the board, quiet but influential. She rarely attended meetings, rarely spoke up, but when she did, people listened. Today, everyone was listening. "Good morning," Mrs. Chen said, her voice soft but carrying through the room like a bell. "Thank you all for being here. I know there's been a lot of speculation about who will lead this company forward." Richard built Meridian on 3 principles: excellence, integrity, and recognition of true talent wherever it exists. People nodded, some taking notes, all leaning forward slightly. "In the past few months," Mrs. Chen continued, "the board and I have conducted an extensive search for Richard's successor. We interviewed candidates from major financial institutions across the country. Impressive resumes, prestigious degrees, powerful connections." Tiffany smiled slightly, probably imagining herself climbing the ladder under whichever Ivy League shark they'd chosen. "But something Richard taught me," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes scanning the room, "is that credentials don't always tell you who someone truly is. Sometimes, the most extraordinary people are right in front of you, and you don't see them because you're looking in the wrong direction." Valencia had reached the door now, her cart half in and half out of the conference room. She paused, one hand on the handle. Mrs. Chen turned to face her. "Valencia, dear, would you mind closing that door and joining us?" The room fell silent. Confused glances ricocheted around the space like stray bullets. Valencia's hand tightened on the cart handle. "Ma'am?" "Please," Mrs. Chen said gently. "Leave the cart. Come sit." Tiffany's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. Brandon looked around as if to confirm he was really witnessing this. Jasmine's mouth literally fell open. Valencia stepped back into the room, leaving her cart in the hallway. She moved slowly, her uniform suddenly feeling heavier than it had moments before. Every eye in the room was on her now, and she was no longer invisible. She was exposed, vulnerable. Mrs. Chen gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table, Richard's old seat, and Valencia's steps faltered. "Mrs. Chen, I don't understand." "Sit down, Valencia," Mrs. Chen said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't a suggestion. Valencia sat. The leather chair felt foreign beneath her, like sitting on a throne made of memories and broken dreams. Mrs. Chen turned back to the room, her hands clasped in front of her. "I want to tell you all a story about this woman. 22 years ago, my husband hired a brilliant young analyst fresh out of Spelman College. She had a gift for seeing patterns in markets that seasoned professionals missed. She brought in 3 major clients in her first year alone. Richard believed she would run this company someday. The confusion in the room was morphing into something else now. People were starting to do math, to piece together timelines. But life happened," Mrs. Chen continued. "Her husband died tragically. She had 3 small children and medical bills that would have destroyed most people. She tried to hold on to her career, but the system wasn't built for women like her, women who dared to prioritize their families while also trying to build legacies. She made the impossible choice that so many Black women have had to make: her children's survival over her own ambitions." Tiffany's face had gone pale. Brandon had stopped checking his phone. Jasmine looked like she might be sick. "When Valencia came back 7 years ago," Mrs. Chen said, "she didn't come back as an analyst. She came back as part of our cleaning crew. And do you know what's remarkable? In those 7 years, not one person in this room recognized her. Not one person saw past the uniform to see the brilliant mind beneath it." The silence was suffocating now. "But I saw her," Mrs. Chen continued. "I saw her, and I watched her. I watched her work 2 jobs to put her children through school. I watched her son graduate with a 3.8 GPA in computer science. I watched her daughter become a teacher who's changing lives in underserved communities. I watched her oldest son become a paramedic who saves lives every single day. I watched Valencia Brown sacrifice everything to give her children the opportunities she never got to keep for herself." Mrs. Chen's voice grew stronger. And I also watched something else. I watched the culture of this company shift in ways Richard would have found unacceptable. I watched merit become code for privilege. I watched excellence become code for exclusivity. I watched people like Tiffany, Brandon, and Jasmine, people with every advantage, every credential, every connection, look down on people like Valencia without even bothering to see who they really are. Tiffany tried to speak. Mrs. Chen, I don't think that's... I've been listening, Mrs. Chen said quietly, and the three words cut through the room like a blade. The board approved the installation of security cameras and audio recording systems on every floor 6 months ago. For security purposes, of course, but also to assess company culture, to understand how people behave when they think nobody important is watching. Brandon's face drained of color so fast he looked like he might faint. This morning at 7:03 a.m., Mrs. Chen continued, 3 employees entered this very room and spent 12 minutes discussing a coworker. They mocked her education, her income, her appearance, her family. They questioned why the company employed people like her. They suggested that people from her background were a burden, dead weight, undeserving of opportunity. Jasmine stood up abruptly. Mrs. Chen, if this is about this morning, you were just revealing exactly who you are, Mrs. Chen finished. And that revelation has been very useful to the board. She turned back to Valencia, who sat frozen in the chair, tears streaming silently down her face. Valencia, 7 years ago, I made you a promise. After that morning when we spoke in the hallway, I told my fellow board members about you, about your story, about what we'd lost when life forced you out. We began creating a plan, but we needed time. We needed to restructure certain financial elements of the company, to create an endowment that would allow us to make an unconventional choice. Mrs. Chen walked to stand beside Valencia's chair. 2 years ago, when Richard died, we accelerated that plan. We've spent the last 24 months preparing for this moment, building the legal framework, securing the board votes, establishing the support systems you'll need. Valencia couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. We also needed to see, Mrs. Chen continued, how this company truly operated. We needed to understand what happened when people thought nobody was watching, and what we discovered was troubling. A culture that valued polish over substance, connections over competence, comfort over character. Mrs. Chen placed her hand on Valencia's shoulder. The board and I have unanimously voted to name you the next CEO of Meridian Financial Group, effective immediately. The room exploded, not with applause, but with gasps, protests, confusion. Several people stood up. Someone dropped their coffee mug, and it shattered on the marble floor. Valencia finally found her voice. Mrs. Chen, I haven't worked in finance in over 20 years. I'm not qualified. You are the most qualified person in this room, Mrs. Chen said firmly. Not despite what you've been through, but because of it. You understand struggle. You understand sacrifice. You understand what it means to work with dignity, even when the world refuses to see your worth. Those are the qualities Richard valued most, and they're the qualities this company needs desperately. She addressed the room again. Valencia will undergo a 6-month intensive reintegration program. She'll work with consultants, attend executive education courses, and be mentored by 3 former CEOs who've agreed to guide her transition. She'll earn a first-year salary of $275,000, modest by CEO standards, but with performance bonuses that could triple that amount. After 6 months, we'll assess her progress and adjust her compensation to market rate. Tiffany found her voice, shrill with indignation. This is insane. You can't just make the cleaning lady the CEO. She doesn't have an MBA. She doesn't have current experience. This will destroy the company's credibility. Mrs. Chen turned to face her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tiffany Clark, as of this moment, you are terminated for creating a hostile work environment and for violations of the company's ethics policy. Your severance package will reflect the minimum required by law, and you have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and exit the building. Security will escort you. Tiffany's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Brandon Wessex, Mrs. Chen continued, you are also terminated for the same reasons. Your comments this morning revealed a character incompatible with the values this company was built on. Brandon stood up, his face red with rage. You can't do this. Your father is a shareholder, yes, Mrs. Chen said calmly. I've already spoken with him. He's aware of your behavior and supports our decision. In fact, he was quite disappointed to learn how you've been representing yourself. She turned to Jasmine, who looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. Jasmine Mitchell, you'll remain employed, but you're being demoted from marketing manager to marketing associate. You'll report directly to the new department head, and you'll undergo mandatory diversity and sensitivity training. Consider this your only opportunity to prove you can do better. Mrs. Chen surveyed the room. Let me be clear to everyone here, what happened this morning was unacceptable, but it was also revealing. We now know who among you sees people for what they contribute, and who sees people for what they look like, where they come from, or what title they hold. This company will change, starting today. And anyone who can't embrace that change is welcome to submit their resignation. The room was silent, except for the sound of Tiffany crying and Brandon muttering curses under his breath as security appeared at the door to escort them out. Valencia sat in that chair, her cleaning uniform stark against the luxury surrounding her, and for the first time in 22 years, she allowed herself to feel something she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. Hope. Mrs. Chen leaned down and whispered in her ear, just loud enough for Valencia to hear. Richard was right about you. He's been right about you this whole time. It's time for the world to see what he saw, what I've always seen. You were never just a cleaning lady, Valencia. You were always meant to lead. And in that moment, Valencia Brown, analyst turned mother turned janitor turned CEO, finally understood something that changed everything. She'd never actually fallen. She'd been building character, building resilience, building a foundation strong enough to hold the weight of what was coming next. The invisible woman had just become impossible to ignore. 6 months later, Valencia stood at the window of her new office, Richard's old office, watching the sunrise paint Atlanta in shades of gold. The city looked different from up here, or maybe she was just different. The transition hadn't been easy. There were stumbles, doubts, moments where she wondered if Mrs. Chen had made a catastrophic mistake. But there were also victories. She'd secured 3 major clients in her first 90 days by approaching them with something the previous leadership had lacked: authenticity and genuine understanding of what small businesses needed to grow. She'd restructured the company's hiring practices, implementing blind resume reviews and skills-based assessments instead of pedigree-based screening. She'd launched a mentorship program, connecting senior employees with promising young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. She'd increased the minimum wage for all Meridian employees to $22 an hour because she remembered what it felt like to choose between medicine and groceries. The company's stock had dipped initially, as skeptical investors questioned the unconventional choice. But it had rebounded stronger than before when the earnings report showed increased productivity, decreased turnover, and a surge of positive publicity around the company's values-driven leadership. Khalil had accepted a position in Meridian's IT department, earning it through the same blind interview process as everyone else. Jerome was consulting with the company on corporate health and safety protocols. Shanice had started a financial literacy program in her school, using materials Valencia had developed. Jasmine was thriving under the new structure, having apparently taken her demotion as the wake-up call she needed. She'd personally apologized to Valencia, tears streaming down her face, admitting she'd been taught to succeed by stepping on others, and was grateful for the chance to learn a different way. Tiffany and Brandon were gone. Their Instagram posts suggesting they'd landed at a competitor firm. Valencia wished them no ill will. Everyone was on their own journey. Mrs. Chen had retired fully now, confident the company was in the right hands. But she and Valencia had dinner every Tuesday night. Two women from different generations who'd learned that power used with compassion could change more than just a company. It could change lives. Valencia's phone buzzed. A text from her executive assistant. Your 9 a.m. is here, the group from Spelman College. Students interested in careers in finance. Valencia smiled. She'd started a pipeline program, partnering with HBCUs across the South to identify talented students who might not have the connections or polish that traditionally opened doors in finance, but who had the hunger, the intelligence, and the heart to excel if given a real chance. She smoothed down her suit, a custom piece now, tailored perfectly. A far cry from the Ann Taylor sales rack items she used to stretch her budget for. But she'd kept something from her old life. In the bottom drawer of her desk, carefully folded, was her cleaning uniform. She looked at it sometimes when the imposter syndrome crept in, when the weight of leadership felt crushing, when she wondered if she really belonged in this chair. The uniform reminded her that she'd always belonged. She'd belonged when she was analyzing portfolios at 24. She'd belonged when she was raising 3 children alone on poverty wages. She belonged when she was pushing a mop while people spoke about her like she was invisible. She'd belonged because belonging isn't about what you do. It's about who you are when no one's watching. And Valencia Brown had always been someone worth seeing. She grabbed her tablet and headed toward the conference room. The same conference room where everything had changed 6 months ago. The room had been renovated since then. The furniture was the same, but there was something new on the wall. A plaque that Mrs. Chen had commissioned before she retired. It read, "Excellence has no pedigree. Integrity has no price tag. Dignity is not earned. It is inherent. See people for who they are, not where they've been." Below it was a quote from Richard Chen. The best leaders are those who remember what it felt like to be overlooked. Valencia paused in front of the plaque, taking a breath, centering herself. Then she pushed open the conference room door, where 12 young black women from Spelman College sat waiting, their eyes bright with ambition and hope and uncertainty. They stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that still made her uncomfortable. She'd been invisible for so long that visibility still felt strange sometimes, like a coat that didn't quite fit yet. "Please, sit," Valencia said warmly, taking her own seat at the table. Not at the head this time, but in the middle, equal among equals. "Thank you for being here. I want to start by telling you a story about a young woman who graduated from Spelman 28 years ago with a dream of changing the financial world." She told them everything: the rise, the fall, the years of invisibility, the morning everything changed. She watched their faces shift through emotions: inspiration, heartbreak, anger at the injustice, hope at the redemption. When she finished, one young woman raised her hand tentatively. Her name tag read Destiny. She looked like she might be a freshman, all nervous energy and careful words. "Ms. Brown," Destiny said softly, "what would you say to someone who feels like they don't belong in spaces like this? Like, what if we get here and people treat us the way those employees treated you?" Valencia leaned forward, her eyes locking with Destiny's. "Then you remember that their inability to see your worth says nothing about your value and everything about their vision. You remember that every empire built on looking down on others eventually crumbles, but legacies built on lifting others up last forever." She paused, making sure each young woman felt the weight of what she was about to say. "You belong everywhere your skills, your character, and your dreams take you. And when you get there, when you reach those spaces that weren't built for people like us, you don't just take your seat at the table, you build a bigger table. You hold the door open for the next woman climbing behind you. You use your visibility to make sure others don't have to stay invisible. Another hand went up. This student looked older, maybe a senior. Her name tag read Kendra. What about forgiveness? Kendra asked. Like, those people who talked about you. They tried to ruin your reputation, questioned your dignity. How did you forgive that? Valencia considered the question carefully. This was the one everyone always asked, and it deserved an honest answer. I didn't forgive them for their sake, Valencia said finally. I forgave them for mine, because carrying that anger around would have been like drinking poison and expecting them to die. But here's what's important. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. It means refusing to let their ignorance define my future. She looked around the table. Some of those employees are still here, working under my leadership. Every day they see what they almost missed. Every day they're reminded that the person they dismissed is now the person signing their paychecks. That's not revenge, that's education. And honestly, some of them have become my strongest allies because they had to confront their own biases. Growth requires discomfort. The meeting continued for another hour. Valencia answered questions about breaking into finance, navigating corporate politics as a Black woman, balancing ambition with integrity, and building wealth without losing yourself. She shared her personal cell number, something her executive assistant had begged her not to do. But Valencia ignored that advice and told them to call her if they ever needed guidance, a reference, or just someone who understood. As the students filed out, energized and inspired, Destiny hung back. She approached Valencia hesitantly, clutching a worn notebook to her chest. Ms. Brown, I just wanted to say, my mom cleans offices too, at night, downtown. She's been doing it for 15 years, so I could go to Spelman. And sometimes I feel guilty, like I'm here living this dream while she's. Valencia stood and walked over to the young woman, placing both hands on her shoulders. She's building you, Valencia said firmly, just like I built my children. And there's no shame in that, there's only honor. You honor her by being excellent, by remembering where you came from, by succeeding so loudly that her sacrifices become part of a legacy, not just a struggle. Destiny's eyes filled with tears. I want to make her proud. You already have, Valencia said. Trust me. From one mother to another, you already have. After Destiny left, Valencia stood alone in the conference room, looking at the empty chairs where she'd just planted seeds in 12 young minds. This was the part of leadership nobody talked about, the quiet moments after the meetings, when you realized that your story wasn't just your story anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed to believe that redemption was possible, that setbacks weren't endings, that invisible didn't mean powerless. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Mrs. Chen. The Wall Street Journal wants an interview about the company's turnaround. They're calling you the Cinderella CEO. Thoughts? Valencia typed back. Tell them I'm not Cinderella. Cinderella needed magic. I just needed someone to see me. Mrs. Chen's response came immediately. Perfect. That's going in the headline. Valencia smiled and headed back to her office, passing employees who nodded respectfully, some warmly, some still adjusting to the new normal. She didn't need them all to like her. She just needed them to respect the work, respect the vision, and respect the fundamental truth that Richard and Mrs. Wei Chen had built this company on. Excellence can come from anywhere if you're brave enough to look beyond the surface. That evening, Valencia sat at her dining room table in her new home, a modest place in a good neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, because she'd learned the difference between wealth and fulfillment, and had dinner with her 3 children. Jerome told them about a life he'd saved that week, a car accident victim who coded twice but came back fighting. Shanice shared that one of her 5th graders, a kid everyone had written off as a troublemaker, had scored the highest in the class on the state literacy test. Khalil announced he'd been promoted to senior developer after only 6 months, beating out candidates with twice his experience. Valencia listened to them talk, watched them laugh, saw the confident, compassionate adults they'd become, and understood something profound. She hadn't failed when she'd left finance to raise them. She'd succeeded at something far more important. She'd built human beings who knew their worth, who fought for others, who understood that success meant nothing if it came at the cost of your integrity. "Ma," Jerome said, pulling her from her thoughts. "You good? You've been quiet." Valencia looked at her children, her legacy, her purpose, her why, and smiled. "I'm better than good, baby. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Later that night, after her children had left, and the house settled into comfortable silence, Valencia sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She'd been working on something for weeks, a project that felt almost as important as running the company. She was writing a book, a real, honest account of her journey, the analyst who became a mother, who became invisible, who became a CEO. Not a sanitized corporate memoir, but a raw, truthful exploration of what it meant to fall, to rise, to be dismissed, and to reclaim your power. The working title was Seen, a love letter to every woman who feels invisible. She typed late into the night, the words flowing like they'd been waiting years to escape. She wrote about the burn of humiliation she'd felt, listening to Tiffany, Brandon, and Jasmine mock her existence. She wrote about the quiet strength it took to show up every day to a job that demanded you shrink yourself. She wrote about the radical act of simply refusing to disappear, but mostly she wrote about hope, about second chances, about the people like Mrs. Chen, who saw potential when the world saw nothing. About the importance of holding doors open, building bigger tables, and never forgetting what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. As the Atlanta skyline sparkled beyond her window and the clock ticked past midnight, Valencia Brown, CEO, mother, survivor, leader, understood something that transformed everything. She'd never been invisible. The world had just been looking in the wrong direction. But now they were all watching, and she was going to make sure they saw something worth remembering. Now let me ask you something that's been on my mind since Valencia walked into that conference room as CEO. Do you think Tiffany and Brandon deserve to be fired? Or should they have gotten the same second chance that Jasmine received? And bigger question, if you were in Valencia's position, could you have led with the same grace? Or would you have burned it all down? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I need to know if I'm the only one who would have handled this differently.